The intent of these Divrei Torah is to combine Be'ezer Hashem both a hisbeinenus and a hisoirus in the tzara that Klal Yisrael is undergoing, specifically in Artzeinu HaKadoshah. And to combine that with some Divrei Zikaron for Moran Rosh Yeshiva Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh Levracha. When thinking of a perspective on this Eis Tzara, we can focus on one particular aspect, which will then enable us to use that Hisoirus to similarly take a lekach and a limud from some of the inyonim which the Rosh Yeshiva Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh Levracha was madrich us in. And that perspective on the current Eis Tzara is contained in the words of Rabbeinu Yonah and Shari Tshuva and Shar Gimel and Ois Tesvav. Rabbeinu Yonah says, "V'noimar al ha'anoshim she'einam orchim machshavos lihisboinein tomid b'yiras Hashem." And we can say about those people who don't constantly introspect, think, b'yiras Hashem, v'tihi yirosam oisi mitzvahs anoshim melumada. And all that's contained within Yira is melumada, is from habit, is from rote. Lochein hineni Yosef lahafli es ha'om hazeh haflo v'fele. V'noimar madua derech rishoim tzleicha. Zod Rabbeinu Yonah in a period where the Rebbeinu Shalom's Hanhaga is classified as haflo v'fele, as something beyond ordinary understanding. A tkufa in which we're confronted with the question of madua derech rishoim tzleicha. How is it possible that the Rebbeinu Shalom allows seemingly such hatzlacha to rishoim? And on that the pasuk continues as Rabbeinu Yonah brings, because korov ato befihem v'rochik mikili yisayim. Because even though bepeh we may express loyalty kiviyachol to the Rebbeinu Shalom, a dedication to asiyas hamitzvos, but rochik mikili yisayim, the innards, our instincts, our essence, is distant from that to the Rebbeinu Shalom. It's well known that Yeshivas Chevron had its central avodah established in a legendary shmuz, which Reb Chatzkel Sarna, the Rosh Yeshiva, used to give regularly. It's printed in Dalyas Echeskel and Chelek Bais. It's also printed in the Sefer Zikaron for the Mashgiach of Chevron of Hirsch Palais. The shmuz is entitled Haskolas Hamaisim V'Haf'olas Hamuskolos. And in Chevron, this was known, that Reb Chatzkel Sarna and Reb Hirsch Palais said that the yisoid of the chinuch and the ikir shita of the yeshiva is lahaskil hamaisim ulahafilas hamuskolis, which means two things. All maisim that we do should stem from seichel, should stem from hisbeinenus, should come from introspection. And secondly, the chiyuv of the person to constantly be growing in muskolos themselves, to constantly grow in darchei ha'iyun and madregas ha'iyun. This Reb Chatzkel Sarna was maimed as the central point of the avodah which Yeshivas Chevron represented. Reb Meir Simcha, in the beginning of Pashas Achrimos, brings from the Yerushalmi in the beginning of Yuma that the Yerushalmi compares Misas Tzadikim to a number of different things. Misas Tzadikim is mechaperes like Yom HaKippurim. Misas Tzadikim is mechaperes like Para Aduma. And then Reb Meir Simcha brings from the Yerushalmi that Misas Tzadikim is equivalent to Shivrei Luchos. And Reb Meir Simcha explains that the same way as Shivrei Luchos transformed Torah and impacted Torah L'Doros, There are times where the misa of a tzaddik is not just that we lost the individual tzaddik, but Torah itself was impacted. One of the great losses that we had with the loss of the Rosh Yeshiva, Zecher Tzadik B'Kodesh Livracha, is that we lost a vibrant and living link to the gedulos of the Tifarta, of the crucible in which the Rosh Yeshiva was formed, which was the golden age of Yeshivas Chevron. The Yeshivas Chevron of Reb Chatzkel Sarna, of Reb Hirsch Palei, that legendary doyer in which Chevron stood, what Chevron stood for. Lahaskil es amaisim ulahafil es amuskolis. This is what Reb Chatzkel Sarna and Reb Hirsch Palei said that Chevron in that time stood for. And in that shmuz in Dolyas Yechezkel, where Reb Chatzkel Sarna established this as the central motivation and drive and mahusa of the Ben Aliyah, he began the shmuz quoting this Rabbeinu Yoina. This Rabbeinu Yoina that we apply to the current Eis Tzara, an Eis Tzara of Hineni Yosef Lahafli as Omazeh Hafla Vafele, Madua Derech Rishoim Tzleicha. He said that Rabbeinu Yoina, who attributes this based on Chazal to mitzvahs hanoshim milumada, is the makor for this yisoid of haskolas hamaisim. That no maisim should be done by habit, by rote, just merely to fulfill a chiyuv, but should be driven by and guided and motivated by deep haskala. I think anyone who was zeicha to observe, as the Olam here observed many years, an aspect of the gadlus of the Rosh Yeshiva Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh Livracha was what the Rosh Yeshiva was kasei the mechanech for, is haskolas hamaisim, the odom being a sichli, the odom being that there's nothing that a person does which isn't elevated and isn't sublimated and isn't through and through a reflection of his gadlus haseichel. Reb Chatzkel Sarna in that shmuz goes on to say, primarily, how do we generate that gadlus haseichel so that all our maisim are with haskolas hamaisim? To quote the lashon of Reb Chatzkel Sarna, which could be a lashon written about the Rosh Yeshiva Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh Livracha, he says the ikar oifen in which to do that is al yedei omel haTorah be'iyun. Kechol hayoyse that the odom is omel b'Torah. Kechol hayoyse that's goyim, that he is able to be maskil and combine seichel in all his maisim. Shaloi lahaniach yodoi v'loi lasiach daitoi af rega echod meho'iyun v'ha'amelus b'Torah v'hisalus b'maloiseo v'gilui matzpuneo b'kol machmaneo oitzroiseo. The more a person is a dovik to amal ho'iyun in Torah, the more even the very maisim of the Odom become transformed. If we would have to be magdir what this Katan Talmidim saw in the Rosh Yeshiva Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh Livracha, it's that he lived the chiyus and the oineg which comes from Iyun HaTorah. The Rosh Yeshiva used to say over with such pleasure a Maisa that happened with him and the Briskirov. He described where he went to speak to the Briskirov about a Shevera Teras Kayanim. He didn't hear from the Rosh Yeshiva Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh Livracha which one it was. And he described how the Briskirov sat, and he just stood off to the side behind the Briskirov. The Sefer was in front of the Briskirov, and the Rosh Yeshiva was showing the Shvera Teres Kayanim. The Rosh Yeshiva's son-in-law, Reb Michael Feinstein, came in and sat on the other side of the table to the Briskirov. And he asked the Briskirov, and he said, "Vos redt men da?" What are we talking about? What's the discussion about? Zot the Briskirov, da redt men nicht, da lernt men. So Michael tried again, and he said, "Vos lernt men da?" And the Briskirov said, "Da lernt men nicht, da horvet men." I can't begin to even in some way imitate The koilosu brokim with which Rosh Hashiva said that word, Dahar Vitman. And this the Rosh Hashiva put in that his very chiyus, his very essence, that what the Odom is Haravan. The arevus, the oineg of living for Seichel HaTorah. Which Chatzkel Sarna said, through that the person is Zeicha, that not just is he Zeicha to be Oile b'malas HaTorah, but he is Zeicha to something called Haskolas HaMaisim. That even the Maisim Mitzvah, the ordinary Sigva Siach, the ordinary activity of a person, becomes elevated. The Shiva Zeichatadi וקדושי ברוך would often quote from a Baruch Ber. Torah is not even luft. Torah is not even as essential to a person as oxygen is. Torah, the Shiva used to quote from Baruch Ber, is the Leben Alein. The Mesikus HaTorah was evident from the Shiva's younger years. Shiva, the Chetzaldik B'Kodesh L'Bracha, had the Chaver of David Finkel, with whom as a Bacher he went to speak to Rabbi Zalman about Zrika Shaloi B'Mkaima. At that time, the Mitzuyonim in Yeshivas Chevron were Isaac in the Sugis and Kodshim. The Shiva Zechatzaldik B'Kodesh L'Bracha went to speak to Rabbi Zalman in Zrika Shaloi B'Mkaima. And seemingly Rabbi Zalman was listening. It was a Cholamoyed, but the Shiva wasn't sure if Rabbi Zalman had really fully understood the shtickle. Later, by the Tnoim of the Shiva, to the daughter, of course, of Rameir Chodosh, Chevin Mashgiach. So the Shiva was saying a shtickle Torah, as was Nohug, that a Chassan says a shtickle Torah. And it was Rabbi Yudel's practice, the Mirror Rosh Hashiva, to be chedbasa, the shmaitza, to argue and to be mefalpel with what the Chassan was saying. And Kedarka, Blazer Yudel right away began to argue with Rosh Hashiva's raid. And Rabbi Zalman said, Nein, ich gedenke, zok azoi gut, ich gedenk noch von Zrika Shaloi B'Mkaima. He said, don't interrupt him, he says so good, I remember the shtickle Torah still, from Zrika Shaloi B'Mkaima. The Rosh Hashiva mond gadlus in learning. I was once present when the Rosh Hashiva was on one of his travels abroad, and there was a young man that was brought to the Rosh Hashiva from in that city. And someone said to the Rosh Hashiva, with this young man can we redden af umitum. With this young man you can speak in Kol HaTorah Kula. And the Rosh Hashiva right away reacted and said, can heren af umitum, or can entferen af umitum. Gadlus. Being zeicha to gadlus b'Torah is not an accolade which is thrown around lightly. The Rosh Hashiva lived for kvoida shel Torah, to what real gadlus b'Torah is. Empty accolades of "ken redden afum mitum, ken redden afum mitum" didn't mean anything. Wo halte be'emes? Was is it? When we come to be Messiah now, b'tzoika itim, and want to in some way, as Reb Chatzkel Sarna demanded, to live up to that ideal of haskolas hamaisim and hafolas hamuskolos. So of course the first thing we have, as Reb Chatzkel Sarna says, the eitzah is, as we mentioned, amal haTorah b'iyun. To be Messiah from the Zichrei HaTorah of the Rosh Hashiva, what Amelus B'Torah B'iyun is, where all the Rosh Hashivas, Ramachan Shasa, went into Vimezok Tashir, Vimezok Iyun, to give and inspire B'nai Torah with the delight of Iyun HaTorah, which is so much what the Rosh Hashiva lived for. But let's perhaps for a moment introspect and be Messiah to what to the sum of the depth contained in Rabbeinu Yona's words. If mitzvahs hanoshim melumada, in the absence of haskolas hamaisim, so that Rabbeinu Yona hineni Yosef lahafli esa'am, and that's goyim to something called derech rishonim tzleicha. Why? Why is mitzvahs hanoshim melumada chas v'sholom goyim? Hineni Yosef layaser esa'am hafla v'afela, and his goyim ahanchoga, which Rabbeinu Yona is magdir as derech rishonim tzleicha. The Maharal establishes the Yesod in Gvuras Hashem that there are two ways in which Chas v'Shalom Midas Hadin can be the Hanhaga of the Rebbeinu Shalom towards Klal Yisrael. One is where the Rebbeinu Shalom in the Lashon of the Maharal is maf'il Midas Hadin. And there's another oifen of Midas Hadin where the Rebbeinu Shalom is master panov, and Memele Chas v'Shalom Midas Hadin is sheilat. Chazon Ish writes in Igros that the seichel of the Adam he describes as a way in which when a person seeks with his seichel to gain depth, to gain understanding, to gain insight, to introspect, then he's zeicha to something which Chazon Ish calls in Igros neshikas ha-seichel ha-netzel. That kiviyochel the seichel elyon then becomes fused with his own seichel, which is our basic understanding of what we can grasp in what dveikus means. Kechala Yosef says the Chazon Ish that the person lives with seichel and his boineness. When the words of Rabbeinu Yoina, Orchim machshava is lisboinen tomid b'yiras Hashem, then keneged that the person is zeicha to dveikus bo yizbarach. The more that's weakened, the more a person lives with a lesser consciousness of what Rabbeinu Yoina says lisboinen tomid b'yiras Hashem, then that neshika seichel hanetzel is weakened. That bond, kiviyochel, becomes strained. Zot the Maharal, kechala Yosef that the person is and Klal Yisrael dovuk bo yizbarach. Kechala Yosef that anahogas b'hashgacha and berachna. Kechala Yosef that we become distant. Then zot the Maharal. In that case, memele midas hadin sheilet, in the absence of kiviyochel, the closeness between the Rebbeinu Shalom and Klal Yisrael, both individually and collectively. Memele zot Rabbeinu Yoina, if in us the orchim machshavos lisboinen tomid b'yiras Hashem is lacking, then keneged that there's something called hafla v'fela. Then the Rebbeinu Shalom's hanhaga is no longer something which you can grasp with our seichel, and we're left with a question of madua derech rishon tzleicha. But the more our seichel is focused on the understanding of Drochav Yizbarach, the more our seichel is focused on Yedias Hashem, then corresponding the hanhaga which results that will be hanhaga of rachmim, which then won't be hafla v'fela, it won't be beyond us, and it won't be something on which we will ask madua. To take this aspect, this shviv oyer, this shard of the Shiva's awesome gadlus, to live for haskalas hamaisim, like Reb Chatzkel Sarna says, which comes through the iyun and amala shel Torah. That every act that we do, or even our very speech, as we so often appreciated about the Rosh Shiva, the geschmack, the bren, the koyach that lied even in the ordinary masul matan, which was the kuloi oimer kavod, of the product of that tiferes of haskalas hamaisim for hafalas hamuskalos. We lost. There was shviras haluchos. We lost a vibrant connection to that awesome gadlus of that doyer that came out of Yeshivas Chevron. The Shiva Zecher Tzadik v'Kodesh Levracha, the Mashgiach Meir Zecher Tzadik v'Kodesh Levracha. This was a gadlus which, of course, had its yisodos in Chevron, ulamala b'kodesh, in the gadlus Adam of Slobodka. But we still had an embodiment of what haskalas hamaisim for hafalas hamuskalos looked like. This is what perhaps we can take, kol echad lefi erkoi, to combine the hisoyrus from Zichrei HaKadosh v'HaTorah, to then in some way be mischazik, to be of the anoshim who are orchim machshavos lisboinen tomid b'yiras Hashem, so that anhaga should no longer be anhaga of hafla v'fela, and we should be zoicha adarabah, that the derech rishoyim, we should never have the question of madua derech rishoyim tzleicha, and we should be zoicha to that chazoin of umol haaretz der sadas es Hashem k'mayim leyam mechasim b'mher b'yameinu amen.